Welcome to Magnitude, Issues of Great Consequence. Today I have with me Nicole Bijlsma. I had the opportunity to spend some time with Nicole and was quite fascinated around the work that she's doing. Nicole is the CEO of the Australian College of Environmental Studies. The reason I have brought her on this show is through the course of our conversation, Nicole was talking about how many chronic illnesses are being caused at home. And she is quite vocal about some of the issues that are affecting people's health. But she has a view that is a little bit outside of the mainstream. She's an author of a book, Healthy Home, a Healthy Family. And the tagline is where you live affecting your health. Now, I know that over the years that I have been working with people as an advisor, consultant, and a trainer, I get a lot of people who tell me that they're suffering from health issues. A lot of them believe that they have good diets and they have good healthy habits. A lot of them suffer from brain fog. And not being a health specialist, sometimes I feel quite limited in the advice that I can give them. And even when I do talk about some of my own habits, it's mainly limited to nutrition and exercise. I had never considered that there are factors in our home that have such a strong impact on our health and well-being. And so I'm really excited to be talking to Nicole. Nicole, welcome today. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming down. So it was interesting. We were at a training retreat, and I had the opportunity to learn a little bit about your work. And in that time, the way you spoke and the passion that you demonstrated for your work, that was obviously infectious. But then more importantly, I was quite fascinated, and also you triggered a bit of concern in me, because I thought, what if there are things that are happening in my home that I'm not aware of? So tell us a little bit about your work and how did you get into this?
I was working as a naturopath and acupuncturist for 15 years, and I started to notice a very strong correlation between many of my patients' illnesses with asthma, allergies, infertility, autoimmune disorders, and chronic fatigue-like symptoms with issues in their home. By the third or fourth consultation, many of these patients were saying, well, what do you think about the mold? I've got mold in the house. I can smell dampness. What do you think of that? And I thought, God, I've spent 8 years at university, studied in Guangzhou TCM University as well in China. And I was lecturing in naturopathy and traditional Chinese medicine at uni. And we hadn't covered any of this. So it wasn't until we moved into our first home in Warrandyte, we both experienced sleep disturbances, and I slept well prior to that. And then within 12 months...
This is you and your partner?
Yeah, husband at the time. We both experienced sleep disturbances, and first 12 months I fell pregnant, and then subsequently had 10 miscarriages in this house. The neighbour, when I spoke to her about 3 years in...
Sorry, 10 miscarriages?
10. That was bloody awful.
In a space of how long?
7 years. 7 years. We didn't qualify for IVF because I got pregnant easily, and we went to the recurrent miscarriage clinic at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and they were unable to identify. They excluded all pathology and said, we don't know what's going on, just keep trying. So when you've gone to every specialist and also everyone on the esoteric spectrum as well, natural therapist, acupuncturist, and in the end, I remember being on the kitchen floor after 10 miscarriages going, I can't do this anymore. I don't care if I'm married or not married. And because, women, we're taught to define ourselves as mothers to become, it's sort of, you expect that that's going to happen. And when it's taken away from you or not given an option, it's devastating. But at the time, I told my neighbour that, we had issues with fertility, and she said no one successfully had kids in this house. It's 65 years old. And I went, okay, let's have a look at what's going on. I went back through the timing of when this happened, and it all correlated with moving to this really lovely home, half an acre on the river in Warrandyte, which my in-laws would describe as the B&B. It was very relaxing. And I realised we were sleeping near a meter panel, the electricity panel of the home, I noticed that there was a wasp nest immediately outside our bedroom window, and I had a dowser come in and say there's significant geopathic stress coming under your master bedroom, under the bed. I noticed that we were on a T intersection, so I started to get I got air quality equipment to measure the carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide levels, and they tripled in the master bedroom and take hours to dissipate, after which the peak hour traffic in the afternoon would set in and then increase the exposures. And Parks Victoria used to come regularly and spray pesticides in our property because we bordered Parks Victoria on the Yarra River. So there were multiple environmental exposures that I started to investigate and spent 10 years off my own back.
But is this unique to the type of property that you live in, or is this because when you talk about the type of property that you have, some of our viewers might be thinking, well, it's because of the type of property that you have and where it's located that this is happening.
This is happening across the whole of Australia. If we're looking at condensation issues in new builds, we're looking at 40% of new builds.
But from what you're saying, this could be happening worldwide.
Oh, it is happening worldwide. This is the hidden issue that's called environmental exposures is essentially ignored in clinical practice. And this is what my PhD was looking at, is the impact of environmental exposures on chronic diseases and the ramifications for general medical practice. And what's become very clear is that there's a vested interest to keep us sick. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Exposure standards for chemicals and for electromagnetic fields are done in consultation with industry to determine what's practicable in a workplace. They have nothing to do with public health. They have nothing to do with the fact that we have children that are vulnerable based on their age, their gender, their disease states, their critical windows of development. That's all ignored with exposure standards. So as I started to look at the literature, what became obvious is that environmental chemicals have a significant impact and role in almost every single chronic disease. I'm talking autism, ADHD, right up to the other end, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. If you look at environmental chemicals, last year, environmental chemicals overtook, we realised we've crossed the barrier for what's exposure and its impact on human health. We've already crossed that line. If you look at the scientific literature, many environmental chemicals associated with every chronic disease. So let's have a look at example pesticides. When I wrote my first paper that I published in 2016 on environmental chemicals and impact on health, pesticides came up time and time again. When we changed farming practices in the 50s and 60s, we introduced the organic chlorines, DDT, for example, and that's still breaking down in our soil. Melbourne was primarily an orchard. It's still breaking down throughout most parts of Melbourne. And of course, DDT gets into the body. It's lipophilic. It loves where the fat is. So when it's in your body, it's being passed through the placenta and it's being passed through the breast milk. So it's still affecting the current generations. We know with large population biomonitoring studies that each generation is more and more pre-polluted with these chemicals, and they're having significant impacts on the development of many of these childhood disorders that I mentioned, autism, ADHD. Just to give you a stat, 4 in 10,000 children were diagnosed with autism in 1970. Now it's as much as 1 in 3 in some Australian communities. 75% of those will become adults that will be on the NDIS program and will not work.
So this is it. So 1 in 10,000.
4 in 10,000.
4 in 10,000
we're diagnosing
to 1 in 3.
1 in 3 in some Australian communities. It's around, it's about 1 in 5 at the moment in some communities, etc. So it's dramatically increased. Now, some people would say better diagnosis has increased that level, and that's true, but it doesn't account for the amount of adults that have now been diagnosed with autism.
The problem seems to be on such a large magnitude. You're talking about DDT, you're talking about mold, you're talking about radiation, you're talking about all these types of things. I mean, in a modern society, is there a way to avoid any of this? It's
becoming more and more difficult, especially in built-up areas. So, for example, if we look at man-made electromagnetic fields, they've increased 18 orders of magnitude in the last 4 decades. Never seen in the history of mankind, this type of electromagnetic fields. There's nothing in nature that even mimics the man-made electromagnetic fields from our telecommunications, mobile phone base stations, satellites, all our Wi-Fi enabled devices have been introduced without any requirements to prove safety. Again, it's like asbestos. It was in 3,000 products. Everyone said, but it's everywhere, it should be safe. What people don't realise is that there are latency periods. From the time you're exposed to the time the disease develops can take decades. It did with asbestos, it does with electromagnetic fields, and there's a significant amount of data now that using cell phones, for half an hour or more on one side of the head for 10 years doubles your risk for gliomas and rare forms of brain tumours. The problem is, since they introduced 3G and this type of digital radio frequencies, the latency periods are up to 25 years. We are now starting to see a dramatic increase in the development of these rare forms of brain tumours, including, a very close friend of mine in her 50s who's been diagnosed with this and has a very, it's grade 3, 4, very short half-life of up to 7 months after exposure. I mean, these are meant to be rare tumours, and what we're seeing, and her neurosurgeon said to her 2 weeks ago, we've seen an explosion of these types of brain tumours across all age groups. And he said, I don't know what it is. And I said, if you look at the literature, look at the brain tumours and the latency periods, it's likely to be the introduction of cell phones being used in close proximity to the brain. And now the latency periods has come up. We're getting on to that 20-25 year mark.
But how can you be convicted that some people might say correlation doesn't necessarily imply causation? You said it's likely, but how certain are we that this is the predominant cause of a lot of the chronic conditions that you're talking about?
If we look at the scientific methodology, it's limited. It is not the be-all and end-all. And I would argue evidence-based medicine has kept medicine in the dark at the cost of human health and enabled manufacturers, telecommunications, agriculture, pharmaceuticals to keep their products into the circulation, into global exposure, because they require to actually get to causation is almost impossible. To show A causes B, the reality of what I'm talking about multiple exposures, not just to chemicals, but we now know electromagnetic fields from our Wi-Fi technology can potentiate the impact of chemicals and mold in the body because it enhances the blood-brain barrier. How do you prove that? Doing a PhD at university showed me very clearly the limitations of the scientific methodology because they want to see one cause, one effect. The reality is your kids are being born pre-polluted with hundreds of chemicals. They're now being introduced in school, kindergartens, at home with wireless technologies that impact their cells in their central nervous system, in their heart, in their testes if they're a male, and also causes heat shock proteins and oxidative stress and increases DNA strand breaks and cancers. This is the problem. Science isn't the be-all and end-all, and its capacity to look at multiple exposures and their impact on a person based on their genotype and their phenotype hasn't yet been established. So I think it's really important to be clear about science isn't the be-all and end-all, and establishing, causation, correlation, association, causation. And causation is very, very difficult to establish. Very difficult. It takes researchers their lifetime to prove asbestos caused problems, to look back retrospectively. So I think what we need to do is implement the precautionary principle, which is that the burden of proof should be on manufacturers, agriculture, pharmaceutical, to prove it's safe before it's launched into the global population.
But I suppose it's again coming back to the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, there is nothing more important than health. But is it that perhaps the authorities have determined that a small percentage of people will be impacted by this, but the technological improvements and advances that we can gain as a consequence of some of these products and the electromagnetic frequency that you're talking about, that the benefits far exceed the cost, because there are some people might say, well, look, I'm in the same world that Nicole's talking about. I'm healthy. I'm managing my health through a good diet, nutrition and exercise and positive thinking. So why is it that these chemicals around us and these toxins are affecting more people disproportionately than some people? Have you got any views on why that may be happening?
Well, we know in Western countries that are exposed to more of these chemicals, for example, high socioeconomic groups women of high socioeconomic classes have higher risks of breast cancer. We're not quite sure why that is. My hypothesis is that they're exposed more to these chemicals. They can afford these expensive perfumes and other things like that, and non-stick cookware that, say, in third world countries they can't. I am saying everybody is affected by this. The problem is the canaries in the mine are showing symptoms first. We're talking 1 in 4 people who have a genotype that make them susceptible to mold exposure that result in chronic fatigue-like symptoms because of the HLA genes that they have inherited. They'll end up with the chronic fatigue symptoms and autoimmune disorders, which, by the way, have exploded in Western countries. A lot of people think with, autoimmune disorders, it's just bad luck, that it's just their genes, etc. I'm saying no. Environment triggers gene expression. And I think this is why we've missed a lot of this in medicine and natural therapies, is because the genes aren't the be all and end all. The environment actually determines whether these genes are turned on or off. So being in environments such as, high levels of mold in the environment can affect 1 in 4 people in that environment. That results in chronic fatigue-like symptoms. A lot of people, if they've got a good diet, good lifestyle, etc., that's important because they're more likely to deal with the environmental onslaughts that have come in the last 4 decades. But the reality is 40% of the Australian population, adult population, don't sleep well. 40%. The amount of kids that don't sleep well is off the scale. What has happened? This is correlated with the introduction of Wi-Fi technology into their homes, into their schools, etc. Because one of the most common symptoms of electromagnetic field exposures is sleep disturbances. Now, if you don't sleep well, if you don't wake up feeling refreshed, I can tell you as a naturopath, most people think it's normal not to wake up feeling refreshed. I would argue that, because when I went into naturopathy, I didn't go in there to fix diseases. I went there to help people give a sense of vitality, that they could get out into the world and be the best version of themselves. The reality is most people don't, because they're not, because they're always tired. They think it's normal to not sleep very well. They think it's normal to get a headache every time they have their menstrual cycle. That's not normal. That's not vitality. And I think a huge contributing factor to this is their environment. The amount of kids I see that don't sleep, that have baby monitors, Wi-Fi enabled devices in their rooms, is enormous. We take that away, even though that mother has been at the mother-baby unit in the hospital so many times because the child's not sleeping, and suddenly they're sleeping through and they're shocked. I can't believe it. This child is now sleeping, because electromagnetic fields tricks the body into thinking it's daytime instead of nighttime. It suppresses melatonin. The most important anti-cancer neuropeptide you have in the body is melatonin, and the quickest way to suppress it is to just use your cell phone over long periods of time and bring in Wi-Fi enabled technology, extenders, boosters, routers, cordless phones, Wi-Fi enabled printers, etc., in your bedroom or adjacent rooms.
Are there any regulatory bodies that are supposed to be monitoring any of this in Australia or even outside? I mean, are there health authorities that are supposed to be looking at all of this, or there is really nobody to oversee what's actually happening?
Well, in theory, there are health bodies. In Australia, it's the APANSA, Australian Radiation Nuclear Safety Authority, but they have close ties to industry. They follow the ICNIRP guidelines. So ICNIRP is the International Commission for Non-Ionising Radiation Protection. They're based in Germany. It's a non-governmental organisation of people who have very close ties to telecommunications. And they base their exposure standards based on heating effects. So if, over a 6-minute period of time. So if it's heating your body to a point that's causing heat shock proteins, for example, or currents in the body, if it's magnetic fields, then that's what they set their standards to. The reality is there's thousands of peer-reviewed studies that have shown you don't need to heat the body to cause serious adverse health effects, that this Wi-Fi enabled technology can affect the body at a cellular level and cause high levels of oxidative stress and DNA strand breaks that in turn could increase cancer risks. But this is the problem. It's not based, we don't have long-term exposure standards for long-term exposures to low levels typically found with Wi-Fi enabled devices. Because of these close ties to industries. And it's the same with chemicals. These chemicals that we're exposed to that are allowed are based on what's practicable in a workplace. I can tell you, when you're in a childcare centre using bleach to clean, all the bacteria off the floor, that those children are not wearing personal protective equipment like they would in a workplace where there's adult men that have been trained to wear PPE and implement risk management. So there's systematic problems, failures across multiple industries, and in the end it comes back down to dividends for shareholders. That's the only thing I can conclude it to. Dividends for shareholders at the cost of human health.
Could it be that the authorities just don't know where to start because the magnitude of the problem?
No, they know. The data and the literature is very clear about adverse health effects associated with multiple chemicals. The problem is the way in which science evaluates this is one chemical, one effect, like you said. To establish causation takes decades, like we did with environmental tobacco smoke, with lead, and of course, asbestos. The problem is that the system's failing the public and the people don't know. They think everything on the supermarket shelf has been tested. Most hasn't been tested. There's over 190 million chemicals registered for use on the world's largest database, the Chemical Abstract Service. And every 60 seconds, another 20 chemicals are registered without requirements to prove safety. So it's the magnitude of the problem is enormous. But there are ways that we can navigate this, and the only way I can see that we can get around this is to educate the population, because the revolution happens from the ground up. It doesn't happen from the top down.
So it's an individual responsibility thing more than we can't be expected that the authorities are going to do anything about it. And I think, is that part of your campaign, is
Yes.
to educate the public on it?
Exactly.
Right. So I guess, are you able to share any case studies of recurring issues that you're seeing in people which are not being resolved by the medical industry, and you are now seeing that the problems connect to technology, toxins, or their homes? Is there a recurring issue that you're seeing a lot of, or there may be multiple recurring issues that you're seeing? I'm just curious as to what are you seeing out there when you're dealing with patients?
Most of the work we get as building biologists are people who are in water damaged buildings, in mouldy environments, and suspect the house is making them sick. That accounts for about 70% of the work we do. For example, it was a house I ordered a couple of years ago. I had students with me.
I do want to just interrupt you for a second there. Is there anything that people can ask themselves to say, hey, there's potential water damage in my property? Is it always visible, the water damage?
No.
Okay, so what are some of the signs where somebody should say, well, potentially there's water damage because of what I'm experiencing? Are you able to just talk about that for a minute?
So one of the most important things I train my students to do is to take an environmental exposure history. Now, when you get a client or a family that are experiencing recurrent colds and flus, that don't respond to antibiotics or treatment, they keep coming back and they drag on. If they're getting upper or lower respiratory tract infections, kids are getting middle earaches all the time, they keep coming, tonsillitis, bronchitis, pneumonia, and being hospitalised for that and have no idea why. If they're getting long-term fatiguing syndrome, that no matter how many hours they sleep, they're always tired. They end up with fibromyalgia, muscle aches and pains that are moving throughout the body, and brain fog, poor concentration, poor short-term memory, missing words mid-sentence. It's almost like they're not themselves anymore. And their partners will often say, she's not herself anymore. These are really typical symptoms of a water damaged building. The second thing is, when did they occur? Did they occur when you moved into this house? Or did it occur after you renovated the house? Or did it occur after a water event, such as a burst pipe, drainage issue, etc.? So the timing of exposure happens when they've moved into this particular home. That would be a key red flag for me. If their symptoms improve when they're away from that property, that's another red flag that it could be the house. So they're the main things we're looking at for mold-related environments.
So your house can literally not just make you sick, it can kill you.
Yes.
And that's not exaggeration. That's not a sensation.
I've had patients where that's happened.
And is this type of situation more sort of confined to freestanding homes or high-density living? Are you seeing a pattern there?
No.
Either way?
The cause of mold is moisture. Now, in a healthy home, you're going to have up to 500 spores per centimetre squared in a healthy home. You have spores from the Arctic to the Antarctica. They are nature's greatest decomposers. Fungi is not the problem here. The problem is moisture. As soon as you have liquid water sitting on a surface for more than 48 hours, it will support microbial growth. So the 1 in 4 spores that are viable, 3 out of 4 spores are not viable. They can't germinate. They'll sit there with water and do nothing. But 1 in 4 will start releasing enzymes to break up the substrate. So whatever surface it's on, it's going to start breaking it down to decompose it. And at the same time, it's going to release what we call fungal particulates, spores and hyphae into the air. They contain high levels of mycotoxins, and these are some of the deadliest chemicals known to man. Trichothecenes, for example, they cause livestock kills when they're in contaminated grains, etc. So when you have liquid water, you have this release of fungal particulate in the air that travels through the air, and depending on how big the water issue is, you can have high levels of these spores and fungal particulate and hyphae traveling in that room, going to adjacent rooms and potentially contaminating the house. If, for example, it's in a bathroom and you see visible mold there, that means that the other cause of water is water vapor. So if you've got steam in a bathroom that's causing condensation, if that condensation sits on the surface for more than 48 hours, it will support microbial growth on the surface. And eventually you'll see that as visible mold. By the time you see visible mold, you're looking at 65 million spores per centimetre squared to even register it with your eyes. If it's a little bit of visible mold, it's a little problem. If it's a big bit of visible mold, it's a big problem. The biggest problems I find is most of this mold is often hidden in a wall cavity because the waterproof membranes have failed in the shower, and they can smell damp, musty odour, but they can't see the mold. Or it could be in the subfloor from a drainage issue, or it could be a roof leak where it's coming through. So as soon as you have liquid water or water vapour, or you live in a humid environment, Sydney, for example, when I'm doing auditing there, pretty much everything in those houses is growing mold. I'll use an ATP meter and show my students wherever there's dust, the mold is growing because the humidity in the air is sufficient that the spores are utilising that water vapour to actually start growing in the house. So if those people have a genotype that makes them susceptible to chronic fatigue-like symptoms from the mold, they'll end up getting really sick, really tired, they'll develop the brain fog, and they'll have no idea what's going on. Half the time their GPs will have no idea either.
As I listen to you, I can't help but see that it's evident that you're very experienced and spend many years analyzing this problem. But to the average person, it just seems too big, overwhelming. Are there preventative measures? Have you created, developed, designed some sort of a process through which people can self-diagnose and see what's happening, or even they're able to pinpoint that it might be the house that's causing a lot of their health issues? Because, it seems like a pretty big issue. It just seems like it's one of the biggest issues out there, but hardly anyone ever talks about it. So I guess there are two questions in this one question. Number one, have you developed something where people can identify if their house is indeed the major cause of their health and well-being issues? And second, if it's such a big issue, why aren't we hearing about it anywhere in the media? Why aren't people aware of it?
All right. Well, the first thing, I wrote the book to help the public understand and navigate what potential issues exist in their home, what symptoms that relates to, and really simple tips on how to create healthy homes. The book's it's now in its third edition. I've sold 15,000 copies, and I think it's helped a lot of people based on the feedback that I've had. Well,
thank you for writing the book.
Yes.
Thank you for writing the book, because I think it's a great tool, and I'm certainly looking forward to reading it myself.
I'm currently creating a course, Mastering Mold, for the public on how to identify if mold is a problem in your home, and more importantly, what causes it, how to prevent it, and how to fix it. There is a lot of misinformation out there on mold, using clove oil, using chemicals. Many of the remediators are using strong chemicals that are exacerbating people's health problems. Because once you get these chronic fatigue-like symptoms, you're often chemically sensitive as well. So I talk a lot about how to actually fix the mold problem. And the main thing, as we talked about, was the moisture. You've got to get to the source of moisture, because that's what's causing the growth, which is then causing the adverse health effects. So it's looking at where that moisture came from, how to reverse that, etc. In terms of cleaning it, it really depends on the porosity of the material and the condition. And so I'll go into that in the book, and I'll do that a lot into the course to really simplify it, because many people's insurances companies are rejecting claims unnecessarily when they're actually valid, and these people have got really sick. I've seen couples divorce and separate over what's going on in their house, and I'm explaining it to the partner because the mother is with young kids is at home, so her exposure to fungal particulate is far greater because she's at the house 90% of the time. He's going out to work, so his exposure levels are far less, and also she may have a genotype that makes her sensitive. So a lot of the time I'm sitting down with the couple and saying, look, this is why your wife is having these pre-Alzheimer's symptoms because of the exposure. There's actually a biochemistry and pathology associated with it. This is what needs to be done to get your wife back, because she's not the same person, because she has inflammation, brain on fire, and inflammation throughout her body and that's affecting her hormones, affecting her energy, affecting her ability to look after the kids. It's a very vicious cycle, and it has devastating impacts on the family, but most of the time it's reversible. And fortunately with children, they have what's called good neuroplasticity. So once they're out of the environment, they're able to often fully recover. So it's really about educating them about what the problem is and how to solve it. What was the second part to your question?
Well, the second part is if, it's such a big problem.
Yep.
That, why isn't there enough debates? Why isn't there enough? Are there people writing, is the industry writing white papers and research papers on this? Or are they just simply trying to suppress some of this information from coming out? Because I'm actually thinking some people may be listening and saying, well, Nicole is sensationalizing things. She's selling her programs and her books on the back of this. And there's generally that does come up when you have somebody who is going against the mainstream narrative. What would you say to people like that? And is there other material that they can look at? Just, if you wanted to satisfy people that it's not just Nicole that's saying this, is there any other material out there? Are there other bodies that are investigating this as much as you are?
They are now, but if you look at the literature, unfortunately at university and researchers and professors, they focus on one thing. So when I look at electromagnetic field research, what they're saying is very similar to what I see with chemical sensitivity, very similar with what I see with biotoxin or mold illness, but they're not cross-talking, because in science, they encourage you to look at one cause, one effect. The reality of what's happening is very, very different. So that's why in that book, I have a table that says multiple chemical sensitivity, chronic fatigue syndrome, electromagnetic hypersensitivity. We're talking the same disease. We're talking
So there is a scientific process, but what you're saying is the scientific process has flaws in it.
Yes, and we're talking about systemic failures across multiple industries. We're talking about the National Construction Code and the Australian standards for building construction is completely inadequate. It is not best practice. Currently, if you're getting your bathroom renovated, those waterproof membranes are only designed to last 7 years, the building warranty. That's it. In the past, they were designed to last 30, 35 years. The standards and the National Construction Code are not adequate. So they're bringing out codes and they're bringing out documents and white papers to help the industry, but they're not legally enforceable. If they're not legally enforceable, a builder that's been in the industry for 20 years isn't going to follow it. This is the problem. If you don't mandate seatbelts for people and force them to wear seatbelts to protect them from themselves, that's what's going on. So, for example, if you look at the latest research on new builds in temperate climates like Melbourne and Tasmania, 40% of new builds have condensation and mould hidden by their first winter. Why? Because the way they're building to make them tight 6 and 7-star energy ratings like plastic bags. The focus of pushing airtight buildings in the name of climate change is resulting in massive ramifications for condensation and mould and health problems.
But it meets construction standards.
Yes, which are not adequate.
And that's what you're talking about. That's the problem.
That's the problem, because you need to make sure they forgot to look at water vapor management. So if you're building a tight house that's very, thermally insulated and energy efficient and sustainable, what we're seeing is that these people are getting sick by their first or second winter because there's hidden condensation and mould that's affected the insulation that's now wet. And of course, now it's not energy efficient. So not only is it not energy efficient anymore, but now it's a sick house. This is very common. Building houses without eaves is ridiculous. There's so many ways that we can improve the existing build, but unfortunately it's difficult because the builders complying with the standards, they're going to the court, Supreme Court, VCAT, NCAT, and who's it to blame when they're following the standards, which we now know are completely inadequate?
So you can't just blindly follow the standards. And I think from my personal perspective, I'm thinking there's no harm in being preventative anyway. It's not like there's a downside, right? So I think everybody can potentially be looking at, if they're not at optimum well-being or health, and they've already seen the main medical practitioners and they're finding that nothing's really fixing it. Even naturopaths, as you were saying, that when you went through your situation with the miscarriages, you saw not just conventional medical practitioners, you also saw healers and naturopaths, but even they weren't able to diagnose what the cause of the problem was. Can I just talk to you about what other, let's just say the top 5 to 7 symptoms. You talked about brain fog is one of them, miscarriages, infertility. What are some of the other common ones where if people are experiencing these types of issues, that they can potentially connect it back to the house that they live in being the primary cause?
All right, so mold we've already covered, mainly respiratory tract infections and chronic fatigue.
But I'm talking about the health symptoms that people are experiencing. Can we talk about like the top 5 to 7 health symptoms that would at least should raise the question that maybe I need to look at what's happening in my house?
So as I mentioned, with chronic respiratory tract infections, upper and lower, hay fever. I mean, hay fever can be due to pollen as well, but hay fever, bronchitis, tonsillitis, pneumonia, recurrent colds and flus that keep coming back and not responsive, always check for water damage in the home, always. Chronic fatigue syndrome, check for mold, always. Electromagnetic sensitivity, the first symptoms are often headaches, but also tinnitus, ringing in the ears is quite common with electromagnetic sensitivities. And they also can get palpitations, heart issues. When they're lying down and they get up, they get a fast heartbeat. We call POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia. That's very common. And again, chronic fatigue syndrome with electromagnetic sensitivities. The worst case scenario is potentially brain tumours from long-term cell phone use is what we're seeing more and more in the literature. With chemicals, that's the hard one, because it's not like, you get hit by a car and the car was the problem and that's why I'm in hospital. Chemicals are insidious and they're ubiquitous. So they're being passed in utero. I'm seeing children that are 2 years old that have high lead levels. They weren't in an old house where there's lead paint. It's being passed in the placenta. So now when we take an environmental exposure history, we're realising we need to take the history of the mother and the grandmother because of these transgenerational effects. So with chemicals, you have to take the history from the grandparents and then the mother, because by the time a mother is pregnant at 14 weeks pregnancy, if she has a female fetus, a daughter there, by 14 weeks, the daughter has all her eggs. So whatever the mother's exposed to, the daughter's exposed to, and all the grandchildren are exposed to. 3 generations in one hit. So that's why we need to take this history of chemical exposures, especially pesticides, organochlorines, organophosphates, carbamates, etc., pyrethroids. There's so much literature on pesticides and relationship to, neurodevelopmental disorders, autism, ADHD, and of course, Parkinson's clusters in farmers is quite common. So chemicals is the problem. If women have problems with infertility, they both need to be checked. And what the frustration thing as a naturopath is the woman comes in, but the husband doesn't. He's the one drinking alcohol. He's the one smoking. He's in a knock health and safety where he's exposed to lead, etc. Infertility, really look at chemicals. Unfortunately, when I went through naturopathy 30 odd years ago, if you wanted to get pregnant, you have 6 months. As long as you've got 6 months to prepare, you can have a healthy baby. That's gone. Now we realise it started with your grandparents because of these exposures and the way in which chemicals can come in through the uterus and be passed through 2 different generations. And if we look back at changes to farming and pesticide exposures, now we have the pandemic, and it is a worldwide epidemic of children with autism and ADHD. Very strong correlation. So you look at these chemicals, you see this massive upscale at the same time. So with chemicals, if you've got infertility, definitely you want to look at that. If you've got chemical sensitivities, you find when you smell something, you walk past, the department store or the perfume, and suddenly you have a migraine.
Allergies as well.
Yep, allergies for sure. And skin sensitivities, you look for that. Also, if you say, for example, what's becoming more of an issue is grow labs and clandestine drug labs. Now, we suspect at least 20 to 30% of the rental housing stock in Sydney have detectable levels of methamphetamines. Because of the whole vaping issue and methamphetamine, that's another issue we haven't even looked at. If a family moves into these former clandestine drug labs where the chemicals are imprinted into everything, the kids will start becoming psychotic, their behaviour becomes erratic, they'll have headaches, and they'll often have skin rashes, and it develops within a short period of time. That's when I think, okay, check for former drug use, because there's no registry by the Australian Police Force that enables us to know, is this actually been a drug lab? You know, that's another issue that you need to consider before you rent or buy a house.
Incredible how many daily issues can be connected back to toxins. You, in the beginning of this interview, you mentioned and you admitted that it is becoming difficult to get away from these toxins because they're everywhere. How do you get away from them? What's your lifestyle like?
Yep. Okay, so diet is critical. Seasonal, local, organic and whole. You need to eat food organic, very important. It's not so much because the content of the, carbohydrates, proteins, etc. is any different to normal food. It's just that it has less pesticides. Most pesticides are antibacterial, which means they're anti-human. Your gut microbiome is the most critical biomarker we have for human health. The more diverse the bacteria is in your gut, the healthier you tend to be, the better your mental health status is.
Antibacterial is anti-human.
I think so, yes. We have gone to and convinced the public that sanitizing the house and bringing chemicals to sanitize the house is a good thing. It's actually the opposite to what the research is saying. For example, you look at allergies. Australia has the second highest rate of asthma and allergies in the world after New Zealand. As opposed to the Amish communities, which it's virtually non-existent. When you look at the Amish communities that have no electricity, no chemicals, they have farm animals, very simplistic lifestyles, their incidence of allergies and asthma is virtually non-existent. When they tested the household dust, they found that the bacteria, there's a diverse range of bacteria because of their exposure to livestock and having big families, but they also found high levels of endotoxins, which sound bad, but in fact that's the byproduct of bacteria. That the more endotoxins they had, the more diverse bacteria they had in the household dust, the healthier the kids were. Now, what we've realised from the hygiene hypothesis now to the microflora hypothesis is the more diverse the bacteria is in your house, the lower the risk for asthma and allergies in children. But what we've done in Western societies is we've introduced bleach, ammonia, really strong chemicals, sanitizers. It's insane. You are more bacteria than you are human cells. So this is why it's really important that, when you're cleaning the house, you don't use strong chemicals. You use microfiber cloths, you use slight detergents, to reduce the dust load where all the allergens are, but you don't chemically mutate it. You don't bring in harsh chemicals. So going back to diet, that's important. Eat seasonal, local, organic and whole foods as much as possible. That's critical. If you don't have a good diet and a lifestyle, your capacity to deal with the environmental onslaught is significantly reduced and you're much more likely to be impacted by the mold and the EMFs and the chemicals. The next thing is don't bring in things into the home that could adversely affect your health. And I would say when it comes to cleaning products and personal care products, if you can't eat them, think twice about putting them on. Women have been hoodwinked into using heaps of shit, pardon my French, on their body. If they've got a moisturizer where there's water in it, they have to add a preservative. Most of those preservatives are parabens, which are hormone disruptors, or they're pesticides, which are antibacterial. So when they put them on their skin, their largest organ of the body, they're absorbing high levels of hormone disrupting chemicals, which could increase their exposures or development of breast cancers, for example, and other hormone related disorders. So for me, really keep things simple. Think twice about what's on the supermarket shelf. Try and reduce this rampant consumerism that's causing this global pollution, which I think is the number one issue we have on the planet. Yeah, climate change is a problem, but I think global pollution is much bigger because of its impact on fertility and what the ramifications of that are going to be, in a short period of time in terms of generations to come. So in terms of personal care products, cleaning products, be mindful what you're bringing in. If it's not safe enough to eat, think twice about it. Use your microfiber cloths, get a good vacuum cleaner fitted with a HEPA filter. All these things I talk about in the book. In the book, most of the information is knowledge. The only things I recommend you buy is a water filter, an air filter, and a good vacuum cleaner. The rest is knowledge.
Water filter, an air filter, and a good vacuum cleaner.
Yep.
I'm looking forward to reading your book. If people can buy your book on Amazon.
Booktopia, Book Depository.
Okay,
yep.
Booktopia and Book Depository, and people internationally can buy from those websites as well. And if they want to look up more of your work or even attend one of your online or live events, how can they do that?
Yes, so there's quite a bit on my YouTube channel. If they Google my name, buildingbiology.com.au, there's quite a bit of information, and Mastering Mold is on my Instagram page.
Nicole, thank you so much for your work that you're doing. I think it's instrumental, and I myself have experienced some skin issues all of a sudden, and I think I'm a pretty healthy person, so I'm keen to get into this and look more into what is something that is outside of my current awareness right now. So thank you very much for doing this work. If you enjoyed that conversation with Nicole in regards to some of the common symptoms that people are experiencing with their health and well-being that can be connected back to their homes, if this is something that you can relate to, if it's something that is resonating with you, do check out Nicole's work. I am very conscious of only bringing guests on that are actually doing good research-based work that creates real value out there. So Healthy Home, Healthy Family is Where You Live, Affecting Your Health by Nicole Bijlsma. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Ron.